Raz followed her across in the second EVA suit. The suit was a size too small for his 110-kilogram frame, and he jury-rigged the boot magnets with supplemental clamps scavenged from the cargo handling gear, because the suit's standard magnetic grips weren't calibrated for Korath hull alloy. He moved across the gap with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who weighed too much in a suit designed for someone 20 kilos lighter. "Anchor 3 is solid," he reported. "Netting tension acceptable. Mesh floor sag is worse than last time. Nobody stops in the middle or they'll feel the flex." The second tunnel was rougher in every dimension, more sag in the mesh, less stability in the anchor points. The atmospheric outflow fluctuated as the environmental system cycled between intake and output modes, now feeding a cargo bay already thick with the exhalations of 843 Korath. Faye compensated by manually increasing the pump speed, drawing more power, raising coolant temperature another 2 degrees. The Korath from the upper levels came through in a steady stream. These were the ones who had been trapped above level 50 when the first pass ended, who had watched from their viewports as the cormorant pulled away. They came through faster. No hesitation at the threshold. No pausing to contemplate the void. They moved with a focused, rapid precision that spoke of people who had seen the fire and decided that any corridor was better than the alternative. 912 came through before Harwick called the disconnect. The last group to cross included a Korath communications technician who stopped on the ramp and turned back toward the tunnel. Raz caught her arm. She pulled free with 3 of her 4 hands and pointed at the airlock. "There are still people in the stairwell between 65 and 70. I can hear them on the internal comms. 12, maybe 15. They were trapped when the level 66 blast doors closed automatically." "The blast doors closed because the fire is on 66, Raz said. "That stairwell is in the thermal zone." "They are alive, I can hear them." Raz looked at the camera feed from the tunnel. The netting anchor points were flexing. The vibration from below was getting worse. He looked at her compound eyes, at the absolute certainty in them, at the question she was asking even though she already knew the answer. "I'm sorry," he said. And he was. He was sorry in the way you can only be sorry when the arithmetic is clear, and the arithmetic is wrong, and you have to live with both of those things simultaneously. She turned and walked into the cargo bay without looking back. These evacuees were in worse shape than the first group. Burns along their carapace joints, where the heat from the fire front had found the softer tissue between armored segments. Respiratory spiracles wheezing smoke damage from contaminated air seeping upward for over 2 hours. Several had lost the use of 1 or more arms where joint cartilage had stiffened from dehydration. 3 Korath from level 55 had severe carapace fractures, the outer chitinous layers cracked and flaking, the underlying tissue weeping hemolymph. Cole treated them with burn gel designed for human skin, applied rehydration patches formulated for human dermal absorption, used wound sealant certified for human tissue. Wrong species, wrong biochemistry. The gel sealed the wounds anyway. The hemolymph flow stopped. The rehydration patches reduced the spherical inflammation. One of the fracture patients, a maintenance worker whose badge translated as Savith, grabbed Cole's arm with 2 hands. "This substance is formulated for your species. Korath hemolymph has a different pH, a different protein structure. This should not work." Cole looked at him evenly. "I'm not going to argue with results. Hold still." Savith held still. The sealant set. Cole moved to the next patient without pausing, because there were 11 more waiting, and he had 1 kit of human medical supplies that apparently did not care about species boundaries. Harwick ordered the disconnect at minute 14, when the netting anchors were flexing 5 centimeters in their mounts, and the rightmost emitted a metallic pop that Maeve described as a clamp exceeding its rated shear load by approximately everything. Netting retracted, bay door sealed, second pass complete. 1,755 Korath aboard the cormorant, packed into every available space. Environmental systems at 112% in climbing. 2 scrubbers on amber caution. The air carried ozone, copper, overheated electronics, and the scent of Korath stress pheromones that would linger in the ventilation for months. Over 2,000 Korath still in the spire. Fire at level 58. Den, Faye's voice was quiet, the quiet of arithmetic that does not care about courage. Third pass exceeds our life support capacity. We're already past safe limits, if anything else fails with this many aboard. Everyone dies, ours and theirs. So, he looked at the spire, fire climbing, 2,200 above it, Navy 8 hours out. We're going back. Faye exhaled, not protest, acceptance. The sound of someone who had known the answer before she asked the question, because she had served with Den Harwick for 6 years, and she knew what kind of man sat in that chair when the numbers said stop, and the fire said keep going. She had watched him make hard decisions before the time he held position beside a disabled tanker in a debris field for 9 hours, because the tanker's crew of 3 couldn't evacuate without assistance. The time he detoured 11 days off schedule to deliver emergency medical supplies to a colony that wasn't on any commercial route. Each time, the decision had been the same. Not reckless, not heroic. Just the simple, stubborn arithmetic of a man who counted lives the way other captains counted cargo tonnage. Harwick checked the time. 14 minutes since the second pass disconnect. The fire had gained 4 more floors. The spire's vibration pattern had changed. During the first approach, the tremors had been intermittent individual structural elements failing, each one a discrete event. Now the vibration was continuous, a low-frequency hum that traveled through the spire's frame. The hum meant the fire was no longer consuming individual floors. It was consuming the structure itself, load-bearing columns, lateral bracing members. The skeleton that held the spire upright. Third approach, level 90, the spire's uppermost emergency airlock. The gap here was 4 meters, nearly twice the original distance. The spire's upper section was barely wider than the cormorant's cargo ramp, and protruding antenna mounts and sensor arrays jutted from the exterior like quills. Maeve used a cable launcher borrowed from the cargo rigging system, a tool designed for firing anchor lines across the gap between a freighter and an orbital loading platform, repurposed for something its designers had never imagined. She fired the bolt into the Korath airlock frame. Raz used the cable as a guide rail to string the netting, pulling himself hand over hand, while his thruster pack fired in controlled bursts against the spire's rotation. The tunnel swayed badly. The spire was vibrating continuously, now not isolated shudders, but a low-frequency tremor propagating through the entire structure as the fire consumed its midsection and thermal stresses redistributed weight loads the frame was never designed to carry. Through the netting walls, looking down past the mesh floor, the fire front was visible at level 65. The midsection glowed red and amber, and through ruptured hull segments the flames were visible inside sustained, fed fires, not the brief starving blooms of venting atmosphere from earlier. The Korath came through faster this time. Word had traveled through the upper levels. The human ship was making a third pass, the tunnel was open, and this was the last exit. They came with the focused urgency of people who could feel the heat rising through the floor plates beneath their feet. Adults carried children with all 4 arms wrapped tight. Archivists carried data crystals. A group of maintenance workers came through in a chain, each one holding the arm of the person behind them, guiding a colleague whose compound eyes had been damaged by flash exposure. An elderly teacher came through with 6 juveniles clinging to her lower arms, their soft-jointed carapaces pressed close to hers. She had wrapped scraps of dampened fabric over their spiracles as improvised smoke filters, each one torn from the hem of her own robe. By the time she reached the ramp, her robe ended at her knees, and the fabric over the last juvenile spiracles was dry. One elderly Korath, his carapace faded to a dull bronze that spoke of extreme age. The joints stiffened, and the compound eyes clouded with cataracts, carried a single crystalline tablet the size of a human hand. He clutched it with all four arms, two wrapped around its face, two bracing it from below, holding it against his thorax with the careful, deliberate grip of a man carrying something more important than himself, more important than the building he was leaving, more important than anything he owned or had ever owned. He stopped at the ramp and looked at Harwick, who had come down to the cargo bay to help direct evacuees into the remaining open spaces. "This is the founding record of Kethon 4, the old archivist said. His translated voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. "It documents the first administrative act performed on this asteroid 11,000 years ago. It is the oldest continuously maintained administrative record in the Korath civilization. It has never left its vault. It has never been held outside the founding chamber." "Find a safe spot in the bay," Harwick said. "Hold on to it." The old archivist nodded and moved into the crowd. At minute 9 of the third pass, the cormorant's main atmospheric scrubber failed. The centrifugal separator, which spun contaminated air through filter stages to extract CO2 and particulates, had been running at 112% capacity for over 2 hours, processing the exhalations of nearly 2,000 bodies through filter media rated for 9. The bearings, overheated and lubricant-starved, seized. The separator drum ground to a halt with a metallic shriek that traveled through the ship's frame like a scream. "Main scrubber offline," Faye reported. "Bearing failure. Non-recoverable without replacement parts we don't carry. Backup 1 at 87% and declining. Backup 2 at 91. CO2 climbing approximately 2% per minute." "How long?" "At current population density, cognitive impairment in 40 minutes. Dangerous levels in 55. Lethal concentration in approximately 70. 70 minutes. Harwick looked at the tunnel camera. 400 Korath were still waiting on the spire side. More were descending from the uppermost levels. He kept the tunnel open. Every person who crossed was one more life pulled out of the arithmetic. He watched the CO2 gauge climb and made the kind of decisions that don't fit in any manual because no manual covers this. Faye opened the cargo bay's exterior venting system without being asked. Manual override on the exhaust valves. She dumped CO2 heavy air to space and pumped replacement oxygen from the reserve tanks. The air quality indicators flickered from red to amber green, a countdown pretending to be a solution. They were spending reserves that would not be replenished, and when the tanks emptied, the CO2 would begin climbing again with nothing left to compensate. 3 hours of breathable air remaining at this burn rate. The Korath Navy was still 7.5 hours out. The arithmetic was a 4.5-hour deficit that no amount of engineering could close. At minute 11, a section of the netting's mesh floor tore along a weld seam. A gap opened barely 15 centimeters wide, but enough for the vacuum below to create a localized pressure differential that turned the tunnel into a wind tunnel for 3 seconds. 2 Korath mid-crossing stumbled. One dropped to her knees, a data crystal skittering toward the tier. Raz caught her with one arm and slapped sealant tape over the tier with the other. 4 seconds. The tape held. The crystal had fallen through and was gone, spinning into the dark toward the asteroid's surface. The archivist who had dropped it stood on the ramp for a moment, looking back. 11,000 years of records lost in a 4-second tier. Then she turned forward and walked into the cargo bay without a word. She did not cry. She walked forward, because standing still was not an option the Korath had given themselves. The last Korath came through at minute 16. A young archivist, barely adult, carrying 2 data crystals and a manifest tablet gripped so hard her finger joints had gone white. She stumbled at the ramp threshold and Raz caught her and set her on her feet. Behind her, the tunnel swayed in the thermal updraft from the fire front, which had reached level 85, and was consuming the structure with an accelerating hunger that sent visible heat shimmer across the gap between the ships. "That's the last from 92 through 112, Maeve reported from the tunnel's far end, her voice steady despite the fact that the netting beneath her boots was oscillating in 3-second cycles. "Stairwells are clear. No more movement on the internal sensors." Tunnel retracted for the final time. Bay doors sealed. 1,862 from the third pass. 3,617 Koreth aboard the Cormorant, a ship designed for 9. The number was absurd. The number was impossible. The number was the difference between every Koreth above the fire line being dead and every Koreth above the fire line being alive, minus the 1,195 who were below it when Harwick arrived. He held that number 3,617, the way the old archivist held the founding tablet, with both hands, with everything he had. With the knowledge that the number was not large enough and never could be, because the other number 1,195 existed too, and always would. Through the viewport, Harwick watched the spire's upper section, the last 22 floors, the record vaults, the administrative chambers, the founding vault that had held that crystalline tablet for 11,000 years, begin its final collapse. The structure sagged to one side as the fire consumed its load-bearing midsection. Emergency blast doors held for 11 more minutes, their thermal ratings exceeded by a factor of 3, but holding anyway through the mechanical stubbornness of well-engineered hardware. Then they buckled. The atmosphere inside the upper section vented through 100 structural seams simultaneously, and the escaping gases ignited as they hit exposed conduits. The top of the spire tore free from the asteroid and tumbled into space, trailing atmosphere and fire and fragments of 11,000 years of meticulous record-keeping. It burned as it went. Data crystals vaporized. Record vaults that had survived 2 wars, a plague, and 4 administrative reorganizations were consumed in seconds. The conflagration lasted 45 seconds, and in those 45 seconds more recorded history was lost than most civilizations produce in a century. Harwick watched it through the viewport. He watched it because someone should. Because when 11,000 years of documentation burns, the least you can do is bear witness to the fire. The spire had held 4,812, according to the census data archivist Voronath had transmitted during the second pass. The missing 1,195 were the ones below the fire line when the Cormorant arrived, the ones whose floors were already dark, the ones who were already gone before Harwick ever turned his ship around. He set both numbers side by side in his mind, one that represented what he had done, one that represented what he could not have done. He held them both without letting either one consume the other, and he kept working. Harwick returned to the bridge and assessed the situation with the compartmentalized efficiency of a man who had run out of emotions to spend. 3,617 people in a ship rated for 9. Environmental systems past their limits. 1 scrubber failed, 2 declining. CO2 climbing. Temperature climbing. Water finite. Oxygen finite. And the Koreth garrison fleet still 7 hours away at best, assuming the omnidirectional signal had reached them at all. The next 5 hours were the worst of his life. Not because of any single crisis, because of the accumulation. The slow, grinding arithmetic of too many bodies in too small a space with too little air, and too much time between now and rescue. Each hour brought a new failure, a new improvisation, a new calculation that came back with numbers that didn't work, followed by a crew that made them work anyway through stubbornness and ingenuity, and the refusal to accept that the math was final. Hour 1. The temperature. 3,600 bodies packed into enclosed spaces generated metabolic heat that the Cormorant's cooling system could not dissipate fast enough, even with every external radiator panel opened and the cooling loops at maximum. The ambient temperature in the cargo bay reached 38 degrees Celsius within 40 minutes and kept climbing. The Korath, whose native comfort range centered around 30 degrees, began showing thermal stress, compound eyes dimming, spherical rates increasing. The stress pheromone scent thickening until Harwick could taste it at the back of his throat like copper dissolved in warm water. Raz organized the cargo handlers into a rotation, moving through the holds with portable fans scavenged from the engine room ventilation system, directing airflow across the densest clusters of Korath. Not enough, but enough that the thermal indicators stabilized instead of climbing. Hour 2, the water. The emergency stores ran out faster than projected because Korath metabolic water loss under thermal stress exceeded human rates by a factor of roughly 1.4, a number Cole calculated by monitoring spherical output across a sample of 20 adults. He distributed the last of the stores, then improvised condensation recovery traps in the atmospheric ducting. The system produced liters where hundreds were needed. Korath children drank first, then the injured, then adults in a rotation that the archivists managed with their characteristic meticulous precision, every cup measured, every recipient identified and logged on a crystalline data core that a senior archivist activated with a touch. Even here, even packed into the sweltering hold of a freighter that had never been meant for them, the Korath kept records. Harwick would learn later that the archivists maintained a complete log of water distribution throughout the crisis, every recipient, every quantity, every timestamp on a data crystal no larger than a human thumb. It was the most thorough record of a disaster in progress that he had ever seen, and it was being compiled by people who were inside the disaster. Mikkel found 12 liters of emergency water cached in a hull void behind the portside cargo bay wall. The cache had been left there by a previous crew, sealed, unlabeled, forgotten. He found it by running his hand along the wall seam looking for loose panels, the way a veteran cargo handler checks for structural integrity before a heavy load. The panel shifted. The water was behind it, 12 liters, enough for 60 Korath children for 1 hour. He carried it to Cole without comment. Harwick's crew did not drink. Not Faye, not Raz, not Maeve, not Cole, not the 4 cargo handlers. Nobody discussed it. Nobody needed to. The decision had been made the moment they turned the ship around, and everything that followed was just the unfolding of that single choice into 1,000 smaller ones, each of them equally clear. Hour 3 approached, and the air went bad gradually, then all at once. Maeve's improvised oxygen rationing system, manually cycling the reserve tank flow valves every 6 minutes to match real-time CO2 output rates. She calculated on a handheld tablet using metabolic models designed for human physiology, adjusted for Korath mass and respiratory rates through educated guesswork, stretched 4 hours of reserves to 4.5. She sat cross-legged on the engine room floor with the tablet balanced on her knee and the flow valve controls within arm's reach, and she did not move from that spot for 4 hours. Every 6 minutes, she checked the numbers. Every 6 minutes, she adjusted the valve. Every 6 minutes, she bought them another 6 minutes. Cole taught the nearest Korath a breathing protocol. Slow inhale through the upper spiracles. Hold for 3 seconds. Slow exhale through the lower spiracles. The pattern reduced individual CO2 output by roughly 12%. 12% across 3,600 bodies was the difference between 70 minutes and 80. The Korath learned it in 2 repetitions and taught it to their neighbors, and within 15 minutes the entire cargo bay was breathing in unison, a slow, rhythmic pulse of inhalation and exhalation that sounded like the ship itself was alive. At minute 42 of hour 3, the reserve tanks ran dry. The gauges dropped to 0 with a finality that the hissing emptiness of the feed lines underscored. Faye noted the exact timestamp in the ship's log, 16:42:07 local. The precision was automatic. In a crisis, Faye documented everything, because documentation was the only form of control she had left when the engineering solutions ran out. Maeve and Raz built a crude electrolysis unit. They scavenged the membrane from the water purification system, wired it to a power supply pulled from the cargo bay's lighting circuit, and began splitting water molecules to extract breathable oxygen. The unit hummed and crackled and produced a thin, unsteady stream of O2 that was enough to slow the CO2 climb to something survivable. Barely. The margin between breathable and not breathable was measured in fractions of a percent. By hour 3, the temperature in the cargo bay had reached 41 degrees. In the reactor access corridor, it was 44. The Korath endured it with a discipline that Harwick found more impressive than anything else he witnessed that day. They regulated their breathing, reduced their metabolic output, and sat in orderly rows in the sweltering hold. No complaints, no unnecessary movement, no panic. Savith, the maintenance worker with the thoracic fracture, had positioned himself at the center of the fracture patients. Back braced against a cargo tie-down bracket, 4 arms arranged so the cracked plate carried no tension, he recited in a low, steady voice the contents and catalog numbers of every maintenance locker on levels 60 through 70. It was a distraction technique. A Korath version of counting sheep, keeping the others focused on the familiar and the procedural so they did not focus on the heat and the thin air and the pain and the alien ship, and the fact that they were breathing oxygen extracted from water that was supposed to be cooling a reactor. At hour 4, Senior Archivist Voronnath found Harwick on the bridge. Carapace smoke-blackened, one arm at a bad angle, compound eyes dulled with exhaustion. He spoke with a formality that the translation software rendered with unusual precision, as though the words carried structural weight. I must record the following for the permanent archive. At no point during these events did Captain Den Harwick operate under Directive Enshal 7. At no point was he authorized or directed by any Korath authority to perform an evacuation. At no point did he possess the equipment, training, personnel, or jurisdictional standing to conduct rescue operations within Korath sovereign territory. Harwick waited. He came anyway, because we were on fire and he was close and nobody else was coming. Voronnath's compound eyes held steady. This is the most significant act of interspecies aid in the 11,000-year documented history of Kethon 4, performed by a cargo hauler who heard us by accident because our transmitter was broken. Your people kept perfect order through 3 evacuations under deteriorating conditions, Harwick said quietly. No stampede, no panic, children first every time. Your archivists managed the loading sequences better than any military operation I've seen. We are record keepers, Captain. We document everything. In 11,000 years, we have never had to document a human answering a distress call not addressed to him. Voronnath paused. I do not have the correct form for this event. Make one up. I believe I will. At hour 5, Petra Soames, the number 2 cargo handler, a woman who had been with the crew for 11 months and who rarely spoke in sentences longer than 5 words, sat down on the deck outside the secondary hold and did not get up. Cole found her there during a supply run, her back against the corridor wall, her eyes open, her skin the color of old wax. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, CO2 aggravated hypotension. She had been distributing water to the Korath in the secondary hold for 3 hours without drinking any herself, moving continuously in 43-degree heat, and her body had quietly decided it was done. Cole put her on an IV drip from the last bag in his kit. He found a spot for her in the maintenance crawlway where the air was marginally cooler. Maeve had rigged a supplemental ventilation duct that pulled from the engine room's emergency cooling circuit, and he told her to stay there. Can't, she said. The kids in hold 2 need another water rotation in 20 minutes. Someone else will do it. Nobody else knows where I put the condensation traps. Then tell me and I'll do it. She told him, He did it. She stayed in the crawlway and drifted into a shallow sleep that was half unconsciousness and half her body's attempt to shut down systems it could no longer afford to run. At hour 5.5, backup scrubber number 2 failed. The filter media, saturated beyond recovery with particulates and biological compounds that human atmospheric filters were never designed to process, collapsed in its housing. The airflow through the scrubber dropped to 12% of rated capacity and continued declining. CO2 levels climbed past the dangerous threshold and into the range that Harwick's medical database labeled with clinical detachment as impaired judgment and motor function degradation, risk of unconsciousness in sustained exposure. His hands felt thick on the console. His vision had narrowed at the edges, the peripheral field going soft and dark, and when he turned his head too quickly, the bridge seemed to lag behind the motion for a fraction of a second. In the cargo bay, the Koreth were sitting motionless in their rows, breathing slowly, their compound eyes dulled. Some of the children had stopped moving entirely, curled against their parents' carapaces with spiracles cycling in a shallow, rapid rhythm that Cole identified as the Koreth equivalent of panting. Maeve's electrolysis unit was producing oxygen at its absolute maximum output. The membrane was overheating. The power supply was cycling irregularly, and the output was not enough. The math was simple and merciless, more lungs consuming oxygen than the system could replace. 90 minutes until the Koreth Navy's earliest estimated arrival. 90 minutes of breathable air that did not exist. Harwick made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He made it the way he made most decisions, by looking at the numbers, accepting what the numbers said, and doing the thing the numbers required regardless of whether the thing was sane or advisable or anything that a reasonable person would call a good idea. The numbers said, 90 minutes of air needed, 0 minutes of air available, 1,200 liters of water sitting in the reactor cooling loop doing nothing useful for 3,600 people who were slowly suffocating. Faye, divert reactor cooling water to the electrolysis unit, primary loop. Faye turned from her console with the careful deliberation of someone compensating for impaired reflexes. The primary cooling loop holds 1,200 liters. If I divert that water, the reactor loses its primary heat sink. Temperature will climb. We'll have to reduce output to prevent a thermal excursion, and if we reduce output too far, the electrolysis unit loses the power it needs to run. How much cooling water can we pull and keep the reactor below its thermal ceiling? At reduced output 70%, I can pull 600 liters. 700 if I accept temperatures within 5 degrees of the red line. 700 liters of water, split into hydrogen and oxygen. How much breathable air? She ran the numbers with exaggerated precision. Approximately 90 minutes of supplemental oxygen at current consumption rates. 90 minutes of borrowed air, extracted from the water that kept their reactor from melting. It was exactly the deficit they needed to bridge, with zero margin. If the Navy arrived at their earliest estimate, the math worked. If they were late by even 10 minutes, the math did not work, and Harwick would be sitting on a bridge running out of oxygen with 3,600 people in his holds running out of oxygen with him. Do it. She did it. The reactor temperature began climbing immediately as 700 liters of coolant drained from the primary loop into the holding tank that fed the electrolysis unit. Harwick cut power to every non-essential system aboard the Cormorant. Navigation displays went dark. Long-range communications dropped to standby. Sensor arrays powered down. The ship's automated monitoring systems shut off one by one, leaving Harwick flying blind in every direction except straight ahead. The artificial gravity reduced to 70%, and 3,600 Koreth grabbed for whatever surface was nearest as the weight left their bodies, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath them. The lights dimmed throughout the ship as the power redistribution took effect. In the cargo bay, the fluorescent strips dropped to half intensity, casting the packed space in a twilight that made the Koreth's compound eyes seem to glow as they caught and refracted what little light remained. The air improved, not dramatically, not enough to make anyone comfortable, but enough that the CO2 levels dropped below the cognitive impairment threshold, and Harwick's hands stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else, and his peripheral vision came back. And in the cargo bay the Koreth children began breathing normally again. 78 minutes to the Navy's arrival. 78 minutes of air, extracted from reactor coolant, powered by a reactor running on a skeleton crew of cooling capacity. Harwick sat on the bridge of his darkened, dimming ship, watching the reactor temperature gauge climb toward the red line at 0.5 degree per minute, and waited. There was nothing else to do. Every system that could be modified had been modified. Every resource that could be repurposed had been repurposed. Every human on the crew was doing a job that no training manual had prepared them for, running on dehydration and CO2 exposure, and the stubborn refusal to stop working, while there were still people counting on them. Cole moved through the cargo bay in a slow circuit, checking on the most vulnerable. The Koreth with the worst spherical damage, the children who had gone quiet, the 3 carapace fracture patients whose human burn gel seals were holding but whose pain, according to the translation software's best interpretation of their vital indicators, was at a level that would have had a human screaming. The Koreth did not scream. They held very still, and their compound eyes tracked Cole as he moved from patient to patient. And when he stopped at each one, they extended one arm so he could check the seal or adjust the rehydration patch, and then they withdrew the arm and were still again. Faye sat at the navigation console with her hands flat on the desk, watching the reactor temperature display the way a navigator watches a coastline in fog. She had nothing left to calculate, nothing left to adjust, nothing left to improvise. The numbers were set. The margins were 0. All that remained was the weight, and whether the math they had done, the educated guesses, and the improvised solutions, and the jury-rigged electrolysis unit, and the 700 liters of reactor coolant turned into breathable air, would hold for 78 more minutes. Raz sat in the cargo bay with a Koreth child asleep against his shoulder, 4 small arms wrapped around his bicep. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes. He would not move until the child woke. He had decided this without deciding it, the way some things are decided by the body before the mind gets involved. At minute 41, the comm system received a narrow-beam transmission on a Koreth military frequency. 3 words: Garrison Fleet inbound. Harwick closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. Reactor gauge up 2 more degrees. How far out? Type beam means they're in system. 30 minutes could be an hour. Reactor status: 9 degrees below redline. Climbing. 17 minutes to thermal shutdown, accelerating as the remaining coolant heats. They'll get here. They'd better. The Koreth garrison fleet dropped out of superluminal transit 37 minutes later, and the arrival was nothing like the movies. No dramatic flash of light. No thundering announcement. One moment the forward viewport showed empty space and the asteroid and the charred stump of the spire. The next moment, 7 warships existed where nothing had been: angular, slate-gray hulls studded with sensor arrays and weapon ports, each one massing roughly 8 times what the Cormorant did, arranged in a defensive spread that filled the forward viewport with military hardware and running lights. The lead vessel, a heavy cruiser whose hull designation the translation software rendered as resolute commitment to documented procedure, hailed on the same scattered frequency that had started everything. Human vessel, you are operating in Koreth sovereign space without authorization. You are carrying Koreth nationals without transit documentation or species interaction permits. Your reactor is operating outside safe thermal parameters. Your atmospheric systems are below minimum habitability standards as defined by Koreth Administrative Code Section 14. Your hull, is structurally stressed beyond rated tolerances. Identify and explain your presence. Harwick looked at his reactor gauge, 6 degrees from red line and climbing. Looked at the CO2 readout. Looked at the cargo bay camera feed, where 3,617 Korath sat in the dim, hot, thinning hold. Your spire caught fire, he said. I was close. I heard you, so I came. The channel was silent for 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which Harwick sat in the bridge of a freighter that was 6 degrees from a reactor thermal shutdown and falling, surrounded by 3,617 people who were breathing borrowed air, and waited for the Korath Navy to decide whether to acknowledge what he had done or arrest him for doing it. Then the Korath cruiser's captain said, in a voice stripped of formality and protocol and jurisdictional concern, and everything except quiet recognition, "Understood. Maintain your position. We are deploying transfer shuttles. We will take our people home." The word home carried across the cargo bay speakers, where Faye had left the communication channel open. 3,617 Korath heard it. The effect was immediate. Dulled compound eyes brightened. Labored spiracles deepened their intake. A sound moved through the bay, not a cheer, not a cry, but a collective exhalation, a breath that 3,600 people had been holding for 6 hours, released at once. The old archivist with the founding tablet pressed it against his thorax and closed all 4 eyes. The transfer took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Korath military shuttles docked with the Cormorant in rotating pairs, each one ferrying 40 to 60 evacuees to the waiting warships. Korath military medics came aboard and treated the injured, working alongside Cole with a professional efficiency that transcended species boundaries and cultural mistrust, and every treaty objection that had ever been filed between their civilizations. They did not mention article numbers. They did not raise jurisdictional concerns. They treated burns and sealed carapace fractures and stabilized respiratory damage, and carried injured Korath children with the same careful, steady hands that Cole had used for the past 6 hours. One medic stopped beside Cole after treating a juvenile with collapsed spherical membranes. The medic examined Cole's empty kit. "These are human formulations. They're what I had. Korath biochemistry operates on fundamentally different principles. Our hemolymph pH alone should render your sealant compounds inert on contact with our tissue." They worked. The medic looked at the sealed wound. Human sealant bonded to chitinous surface in a smooth, even layer showing no rejection. "So I see. I will be recommending the Garrison Medical Division acquire samples for study. Take whatever's left. I've got more at home." During the transfer, Raz carried Petra from the crawlway to the bridge, where Cole had set up a stable IV station with fluids from the Korath medics. She was conscious but pale. "Was the water rotation done right?" she whispered. "The Korath kids in Hold 2 are alive. I'd call that right enough." She closed her eyes and was asleep in seconds, real sleep. The Korath child who had slept against Raz's shoulder was one of the last to transfer. The child turned back and looked at him with compound eyes trying to memorize a face. Then the parent gathered the child up and carried it through the hatch. Korath engineers came aboard the Cormorant herself. A team of 6, carrying tool cases that hummed with their own power supplies and diagnostic equipment that interfaced with the Cormorant systems through adapters they fabricated on the spot from raw stock carried in their belt pouches. They stabilized the reactor first, restoring the primary cooling loop by refilling it with purified water from their own shuttle reserves, and bringing the temperature back to safe operating range in 20 minutes of work that involved tools Harwick had never seen and techniques that Faye watched with the expression of an engineer witnessing something she wanted to study for the rest of her career. They repaired both failed atmospheric scrubbers, replacing the seized bearings and the collapsed filter media with components they fabricated on the spot from raw materials brought from their own ships. They worked with the kind of quiet intensity that transcended language and species, and every political disagreement that had ever existed between their civilizations. They did not ask permission. They did not file repair authorization forms. They opened access panels that Faye had never been able to open because the Cormorant's maintenance manual didn't include instructions for those panels. They'd been sealed at the factory and classified as dealer service only. And they fixed what was inside them with the practiced confidence of engineers who understood the principles, even if they'd never seen the specific hardware before. Faye stood behind them and watched. She didn't offer to help, because their tools were unfamiliar and their techniques were beyond her training, but she watched every movement, every connection, every calibration adjustment, and she stored the information in the part of her mind where engineering knowledge lived. She would spend the next 3 months studying what she had seen, and the modifications she made to the Cormorant systems based on those observations would extend the ship's service life by an estimated 4 years. One engineer left a handwritten maintenance note on the main scrubber housing. The translation rendered it as replaced centrifugal separator bearings, intake baffles, and all 3 filter stages. Recommend service interval reduction to 200 hours due to extreme contaminant exposure. Engineering note: this machine was operated at 112% of rated capacity for 3 hours on saturated filter media. It held longer than specifications predict. Build quality is noted and appreciated. When the last civilian had transferred, Voronnath returned to the bridge carrying the founding tablet. Its crystalline surface scattered the lighting into patterns like living calligraphy. No external species has ever been granted access to a Korath founding document. I am granting you visual access because, when today is inscribed in the permanent archive, the new tablet will sit beside this one. Your name will be in the founding vault of Kethon for as long as the Korath administrative authority endures. I didn't do it for a place in your records, archivist. I know, that is precisely why you will have one. He walked through the hatchway without looking back. The Korath fleet escorted the Cormorant to the edge of their space. They provided fuel, water, atmosphere, and what Faye called the most aggressively complimentary navigational clearance I have ever read. The cruiser's captain sent a final transmission before parting. The Korath Administrative Authority will be filing an amended species assessment with the Galactic Commerce Pact. The previous characterization of humanity as a species whose documentation practices constitute a civilizational hazard is being revised. Revised to what? To a species that maintains no formal rescue protocol, and therefore cannot be predicted, prevented, or adequately thanked. The channel closed. Harwick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Revised to a species that cannot be predicted, prevented, or adequately thanked. He turned the phrase over in his mind. It was the most Korath thing he had ever heard, precise, procedural, and somehow more generous than any praise he had ever received, precisely because it was framed as a bureaucratic amendment rather than a compliment. The fleet banked away, 7 angular hulls catching starlight as they accelerated. The founding tablet's scattered light played across the cruiser's hull for one last moment before they entered superluminal transit and were gone. Harwick sat alone on the bridge of his empty, battered freighter, cargo bay bare, reactor cooling, scrubbers humming at their rated capacity for a crew of 9. The air tasted clean for the first time in 7 hours, and the silence was enormous. The scent of Korath stress pheromones still lingered in the ventilation system. It would linger for months, that copper-organic residue that had been the biochemical expression of 3,600 Korath bodies in survival chemistry, packed into a space designed for steel. Every time Harwick would smell it in the months to come, pulling a maintenance panel, cleaning a cargo bay drain, Standing in the aft equipment bay that still bore the scuff marks of Korath feet, he would remember the sound of 3,600 people breathing in unison, in a rhythm a human medic had taught them. Faye appeared in the doorway. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hands were still trembling slightly from the CO2 exposure, a fine tremor in the fingertips that would take another 12 hours to fully resolve. She leaned against the frame and looked at him. Velen Reach Colonial Authority wants to know about their girders. Tell them we dropped them. I did. They want to know why. Harwick looked through the viewport at the stars, at the empty space where a burning spire had held 4,812 lives, at the asteroid still turning slowly in the dark with the charred stump of the spire's lower section jutting from its surface like a broken tooth. Tell them we heard something on the radio, and it seemed more important. Faye nodded, turned to go, stopped. Den. Yeah. Good call. She left. Harwick sat with the hum of his ship, and the silence of the void, and the knowledge that somewhere a new tablet was being inscribed to sit beside one 11,000 years old. A tablet that would record how a human cargo captain heard a military distress signal that was never meant for him, a signal that had gone omnidirectional, because the transmitter was burning, and turned his freighter around and made 3 passes at a burning building with nothing but cargo netting and sealant tape, and a crew of 9 who never once said no. He set course for the Velen Reach. He had cargo to replace, an insurance claim to file, a crew that needed rest, and a ship that needed more repairs than he could afford to think about right now. But the founding record was safe. 3,617 Korath were alive, and somewhere in the Korath administrative archives, a new form was being invented because the old ones didn't have a category for what happened today. He suspected they'd call it something precise and procedural, and 11 syllables long. That was fine. He would have called it close enough. The signal hit the cormorant's wideband receiver like a slap. 3 filters overloaded in rapid succession. The kind of cascading failure that happened when raw, uncompressed electromagnetic noise arrived at frequencies and amplitude levels the system was never designed to process. The navigation console flooded with alien script that the translation software chewed on for 4 agonizing seconds before rendering into something Den Harwick could read. 4 seconds was 3.5 seconds longer than translation usually needed, and Harwick had been running cargo through the Tesseran shipping lanes for 21 years. He knew what a slow parse meant. It meant the signal was structured in a protocol his system didn't have indexed, not formatted for him, not aimed at him, not intended for any human ship, in any human lane, on any human frequency. When the text resolved, it read, structural compromise catastrophic, atmospheric containment failure levels 30 through 97, fire propagation exceeding suppression capacity. Requesting immediate military evacuation under Directive ENSHAAL 7. All ENSHAALRATD VESSCLS respond priority absolute. Harwick read it twice. Then he looked through the forward viewport at what was burning. A Korath administrative spire. He recognized the silhouette from docking permits and cargo clearance documents. The Korath built tall, needle-thin structures on their orbital platforms, threading them through captured asteroids like pins through specimen boards. Each one a vertical city of records and bureaucracy and meticulous civilization, stretching upward from the rock's surface. This one jutted from a pockmarked nickel iron asteroid roughly 9 kilometers across, and it was on fire in a way that structures in vacuum should not have been able to achieve. The lower third of the spire glowed a dull, sullen orange. Atmospheric gases vented from ruptured hull segments along the lower section, catching fire on exposed power conduits as they escaped, blooming into curling flowers of flame that starved and died and rebloomed as internal pressure from the floors above fed them fresh air. Each bloom lasted 3 or 4 seconds before the escaping gases thinned and the fire choked. Then another rupture would open somewhere nearby, and the cycle would begin again. The spire was exhaling fire, slowly, steadily, floor by floor, in a grinding rhythm that was getting faster. His second officer, Faye Osterman, came forward from the cargo monitoring station. She stopped beside his chair and stared at the burning needle through the viewport for 5 full seconds, her expression the face of someone doing arithmetic she did not want to finish. "That signal was not addressed to us," she said. "No, Enshal 7 is their military evacuation directive, fleet grade. They punched it on a secured military band aimed at their naval garrison at Korath Primus." "Then how did we hear it?" Harwick pulled up the signal path on his console and traced it backward through the cormorant's receiver logs. The answer was almost mundane in its mechanical simplicity. The Korath administrative spire used a tri-band transmitter array mounted on its upper levels, the kind designed to punch directional signals across interstellar distances, focused through a precision housing on level 38 into a narrow corridor of coherent signal pointed at exactly the right star. But level 38 was, according to the distress header's own damage assessment, already non-survivable. Fire had consumed it 20 minutes ago. Without the housing, the beam had gone omnidirectional, a lighthouse with its lens shattered, throwing light in every direction at once instead of the one direction that mattered. And one lobe of that spray had caught the cormorant's wideband receiver the way a garden hose might catch a passing stranger. "The aiming assembly burned through," Harwick said. "The beam is omnidirectional now. We caught the scatter. Their navy will get it too, eventually. Their navy is at Korath Primus, 41 light years. At best military transit speed, that's 11 hours from the moment the signal reaches them. Assuming they're monitoring the right band. Assuming they haven't filed the frequency as low priority because Kethon 4 is a records archive, not a military installation." Neither of them spoke for a moment. They both looked at the burning spire, and they both did the calculation that neither of them wanted to complete. The Cormorant was a Hadfield-class bulk freighter. 140 meters of pitted, scarred hull plating, an oversized reactor that ran hot on good days, and cavernous cargo bays currently loaded with 4,200 tons of prefabricated structural girders, bound for a human colonial expansion project in the Velen Reach. She had no weapons. She had no military-grade evacuation equipment. She had no rescue training certifications, no hazardous environment protocols beyond what the manual said about venting cargo in case of chemical spill, no medical staff beyond a single crew medic with a kit rated for cuts and fractures and mild radiation exposure. She had a crew of 9, 2 emergency vacuum suits that hadn't been pressure-checked in 11 months, a cargo loading ramp designed to bear the weight of structural steel, and exactly 0 experience with high-rise structural fires in alien orbital infrastructure. She was also 19 minutes away at full burn. The Korath Navy was 11 hours out, minimum. Harwick keyed the intercom. "All hands, this is the captain. We've intercepted a Korath military distress signal. It wasn't aimed at us. Their transmitter is compromised and the beam scattered. Their administrative spire on orbital platform Kethon 4 is burning. Lower third is gone. Fire is climbing. Their fleet is 11 hours out." He let the words settle into the silence that followed. The intercom crackled softly. "We're 19 minutes. I'm not ordering anyone to do anything, but I'm turning this ship around. If anyone has a reason I shouldn't, speak now." Nobody spoke. Not for 10 seconds, not for 20, not for 30. Through the intercom, Harwick could hear the ambient sounds of his ship, the low hum of the reactor, the cycling of the atmospheric pumps, the creak of hull plating under thermal stress from the distant fire. He could hear his crew breathing. 9 people doing the same calculation he had already finished, reaching the same conclusion he had already reached, in the same silence that said everything words would have fumbled. Raz Kato's voice came first, not to protest, to inform. Bay cameras show 4,200 tons of girders on magnetic racks. Emergency jettison takes 8 minutes if nothing sticks. I'll have the bay empty before you're within range. Raz had been a cargo handler for 23 years on ships ranging from the elegant to the barely functional. He had moved everything from medical supplies to industrial solvents to, on one memorable occasion, a disassembled orbital habitat ring. He did not rattle easily. Maeve Solon from engineering, pulling both EVA suits from the locker. Last certification was 11 months ago. I'm doing a 30-second pressure check on each one and hoping for the best. Cole Aberforth from the medical station, inventorying the kit. I have supplies for a crew of 9 with minor injuries. I have no data on Koreth anatomy. I have no idea if our medications are compatible with their biology. I'm bringing everything I have. The 4 cargo handlers Petra Soames, Jens, Mikkel, and Surrey said nothing at all. They simply began moving to their stations, and by the time Harwick had the cormorant pointed at the burning spire, they were already at the cargo bay controls, running the pre-jettison sequence for the girder racks. Harwick brought the cormorant around. The approach took 17 minutes instead of 19, because Faye pushed the reactor past its recommended output ceiling by 14%, and nobody told her to stop. As they closed the distance, the scope of the disaster resolved through the forward sensors and the optical feeds with sickening clarity. The Koreth spire was 112 levels tall, each level roughly 4 meters high, giving the structure a total reach of just under 450 meters from its base at the asteroid's surface to the observation platform at its peak. The fire had started somewhere around level 30, some kind of chemical processing failure in the lower industrial sections, based on the burn patterns and residual spectrographic signatures, and it had climbed upward, consuming the atmospheric envelope floor by floor with a methodical consistency that was almost mechanical. The lower 30 levels were dead. Their viewports were dark. Their hull segments warped and blackened and venting residual heat into the vacuum like the cooling skin of a corpse. The active fire front was at level 45, climbing at a steady 3 minutes per floor. 3 minutes per floor. 67 floors between the fire front and the top, but the upper 30 floors were already partially compromised by smoke infiltration seeping upward through the ventilation system, poisoning the atmosphere in levels that hadn't burned yet. 40 floors of livable space, maybe fewer, shrinking by 1 every 3 minutes. Harwick set that arithmetic aside in the part of his mind that held ugly numbers without letting them become paralysis, and focused on the problem he could solve. Faye structural scan, every docking port, airlock, and maintenance hatch above level 45, anything we can connect to. Already running, she pulled the results onto the main display. The picture was bad. The spire had 4 primary docking collars, all on levels 20 through 25 deep in the fire zone, blackened and deformed. The secondary emergency airlocks on levels 50, 70, and 90 were designed for Koreth military shuttles with standardized docking rings measuring 1.4 meters in diameter. The cormorant's collar was 3 times that. "We can't dock," Faye said flatly. "Nothing fits. Even if it did, the structural integrity around those ports is degraded by thermal stress. Hard dock risks hull fracture on their side." "I'm not planning to dock." Harwick was looking at the cormorant's cargo loading specifications on his secondary display. "How wide are the emergency airlocks? External aperture." 4 meters across, standard Koreth personnel gauge. Double-doored, mechanical override from inside. Our cargo bay doors are 12 meters wide. If I bring us alongside the spire and match their rotation axis, we open our bay doors and extend the cargo loading ramp across the gap to their airlock. It won't seal. It won't pressurize. We'll have open vacuum between our ramp edge and their threshold. But if we pump atmosphere into the cargo bay at maximum output and maintain positive pressure, We create an outward flow, breathable air pushing out through the gap instead of vacuum pulling in. A breathable corridor, survivable if they keep moving. Faye stared at him for 2 seconds. You want to use the cargo bay as a bellows. I want to use the cargo bay as a lifeboat. The bellows is the mechanism. She turned to her console without another word and began calculating atmospheric volumes, pressure differentials, flow rates through a 4-meter aperture at hard vacuum boundary conditions, and the volume of breathable air they would lose per minute through the open gap. The kind of math that should have required an engineering team, a fluid dynamic simulation suite, and at least 2 hours of modeling. Faye did it on a freighter console with a stylus between her teeth in 11 minutes. It works, barely. We lose atmosphere at roughly 200 cubic meters per minute through the gap. The pumps can replace that from our reserves for about 40 minutes per pass before we start drawing down the ship's own atmospheric envelope. 40 minutes per pass. Put that number where I can see it from the helm. In the cargo bay, Raz was dumping 4,200 tons of structural girders into space. The cormorant shuddered as each magnetic rack released its clamps and the cargo tumbled free. 800 tons of Type 4 structural I-beams, 12-meter lengths, gone. 600 tons of cross-bracing assemblies packed in shock foam that burst into expanding white clouds as the vacuum hit it, gone. 400 tons of foundation anchors stamped with the Velen Reach Colonial Development Authority logo and serial numbers that someone in a procurement office had carefully assigned and tracked through 6 months of fabrication, quality inspections, and delivery scheduling. Gone. 4,200 tons total, representing 6 months of fabrication time and roughly 2 million credits of investment. Spinning away into the dark in a cascade of glinting metal that caught the local star's light as each piece tumbled end over end, scattering reflected sunlight like slow-motion silver confetti across the orbital space around the asteroid. Rack 6 jammed. Hydraulic pressure below release threshold on 4 of 8 pins. Raz bent the pry bar on the first attempt, switched to the cutting torch, burned through in 3 minutes. The last 400 tons of girder tumbled free with a sound like a cathedral bell struck from the inside. The bay was empty. Scarred deck plating, the smell of cutting torch residue and hydraulic fluid. 2,200 cubic meters of usable space, cleared in 8 minutes. Harwick maneuvered the cormorant into position alongside the spire, matching its slow rotation around the asteroid's center of mass. The spire rotated once every 41 minutes, a stately, ponderous spin imparted by the asteroid's own angular momentum, and matching it required the cormorant's maneuvering thrusters to fire in constant micro-adjustments, dozens per second, each one a tiny correction to keep the freighter's bulk aligned with the burning needle of the spire. The hull groaned with the uneven stress loads. Faye fed corrections from the navigation console in a running commentary that never stopped and never needed to be asked for. 2 degrees port, 1.3 degrees ventral. Lateral drift compensation, hold. The rotation matching was the hardest flying Harwick had done in 21 years of moving cargo. The cormorant was not built for precision maneuvering. She was built for straight-line bulk transit between orbital platforms, and her thruster array reflected that design philosophy, powerful enough to push 140 meters of loaded freighter on a course correction, but calibrated for adjustments measured in degrees per minute, not degrees per second. What Harwick was asking those thrusters to do was the equivalent of asking a dump truck to parallel park beside a carousel while the carousel was on fire. He did it anyway, not because the ship was capable, because the alternative was watching 4,000 people burn, while he sat in a ship with an empty cargo bay and breathable atmosphere and did nothing. The first attempt to lock position failed. A lateral gust of vented atmosphere from a blown hull panel on level 52 caught the cormorant's port side and pushed her 3 meters off alignment in under a second. Harwick corrected, overcorrected, felt the ship yaw 2 degrees past center, and brought her back with a thruster burst that rattled the hull plating in the cargo bay hard enough that Raz, standing on the empty deck below, braced himself against the bulkhead and waited. "Drift is compensated," Faye said, "but that vent is going to keep cycling. Every time the fire breaks through a new hull panel below us, we get a pressure kick from the outgassing. Random interval, random direction. I can try to predict them from the thermal scan, but the scan updates every 4 seconds, and the vents happen in under 1. Give me what you can. I'll handle the rest by feel." She gave him what she could. She watched the thermal scan and called out when a hot spot on the spire's hull reached the intensity that typically preceded a blowout. "Panel heating on level 49, port side. 3 seconds." Harwick would preposition the thrusters, and when the vent came a brief, violent exhalation of superheated gas that pushed against the cormorant's hull like a fist, he was already compensating before the ship moved. They developed a rhythm. Faye watching the fire, Harwick watching Faye, the thrusters firing in stuttering bursts that sounded from outside like a mechanical heartbeat. The gap between the cormorant's cargo ramp edge and the level 50 airlock stabilized at 2 meters, close enough for the netting, close enough for the breathable corridor, close enough for what came next. Through the forward viewport, the spire filled his entire field of vision. He could see individual viewports now. Behind the glass, shapes moved. Tall shapes with segmented carapaces and multiple jointed arms. They were pressing close to the viewports, looking out at the human freighter that was positioning itself alongside their burning home, looking at a ship they had not called, a ship that had no business being here, a ship that was doing something no one had asked it to do. The comm array chimed. "Human vessel, this is Senior Archivist Thes Voronath of Administrative Spire Kethon 4. You are operating within our emergency perimeter without authorization. Identify your vessel and state your clearance under Directive Unforeseen 7. Clipped, formal. The voice of someone gripping precision because precision was all that was left to hold. "I don't have Unforeseen 7 clearance," Harwick said. "I'm a cargo freighter. Hadfield class, human registry, name Cormorant. I caught your distress beam by accident. Your transmitter housing on level 38 burned through and the signal went omnidirectional. I'm the only ship within receiver range." Through the open channel, background noise. Alarms cycling in a 3-tone pattern, atmospheric systems under strain, overlapping voices the translation software rendered as fragments. Pressure declining on 63. Seal on 54 is failing. Children moved to 98, confirm. Human vessel. Unforeseen 7 is a secured military evacuation protocol restricted to Koreth naval assets rated for. Archivist Voronath, your spire is on fire. You have approximately 4,000 people above the fire line. That line is climbing at 3 minutes per floor. Your navy is 11 hours away, minimum. I am alongside your station right now with an empty cargo bay and enough atmosphere to give your people a breathable corridor to my ship." 1 second of silence. "Would you like to discuss protocol ratings, or would you like to start moving people?" 8 seconds. Through the channel, something collapsed below, a structural element giving way. The shutter traveling through the spire's frame and into the cormorant's hull where the 2 structures were close enough for vibration to transfer. "Level 50 airlock will be opened in 4 minutes. How many can your vessel hold?" Harwick ran the numbers after learning Koreth average mass and height. Empty bay, 2,200 cubic meters. Life support at maximum, 1,200. Open every auxiliary space, 1,600. Shut down non-essentials, 1,800. Maybe 2,000 if the Koreth could tolerate conditions that would make a human deeply uncomfortable. 4,000 people in the spire. 2,000 was not 4,000. First load 1,800. I'll start with the highest floors, work down. At capacity I pull away, come back for the rest. The fire is climbing, Captain. I know we'll be fast. Maeve Solon solved the gap problem. While Raz finished clearing the cargo bay, Maeve suited up in one of the two EVA suits, strapped on a thruster pack, grabbed a roll of emergency hull sealant tape and a length of heavy cargo netting rated for 2-ton loads, and crossed the gap between the cormorant's cargo ramp and the level 50 emergency airlock. She moved with the practiced economy of someone who had done hull repairs in open, vacuum more times than she could count. She anchored the netting to the Koreth airlock frame using the sealant tape and 4 magnetic clamps she'd pulled from the cargo handling gear. The result was not elegant. The netting sagged and billowed in the atmospheric outflow from the cormorant's pressurized bay, creating a tunnel that was more suggestion than structure, a swaying, rippling corridor of cargo mesh, with breathable air flowing through it from the freighter's side and hard vacuum pressing against every seam from outside. A person could traverse it in 5 seconds if they moved fast and didn't think about what was beneath the mesh floor. If they thought about what was beneath the mesh floor, 4 meters of hard vacuum over a 9-kilometer drop to the asteroid's pitted surface below, they would stop. And if they stopped in the middle, the atmospheric outflow from the cormorant's bay would not be sufficient to maintain breathable conditions around a stationary body for more than 30 seconds. The corridor was breathable only in motion, only for people who kept walking. Maeve tested it herself first. She crossed from the cormorant's ramp edge to the Koreth airlock threshold and back again, checking the footing, testing the sag, timing the traverse. 5 seconds one way, 4 if you moved with purpose. She adjusted 2 of the magnetic clamps, retentioned the netting at the midpoint and reported in. "Tunnel is set," she said over suit comms. "It's ugly but it holds. I'm staying here to guide them through." "Copy," Raz at the ramp head. Faye on atmospheric monitoring. Cole triage in the bay. Everyone else crowd management and supplies. This is going to get tight. The first Koreth came through at minute 9. She was tall, easily 2 meters, with a segmented carapace the color of burnished copper. Her compound eyes were enormous, refracting the cargo bay's fluorescent lighting into prismatic patterns that shifted as she turned her head. She carried a crystalline data core in each of her 4 hands, pressed close to her thorax with a grip that said these objects were worth more to her than her own safety. She stopped at the edge of the cormorant's cargo ramp and stared at the interior. Bare deck plating scarred by 6 weeks of loaded girder racks, grimy walls, the residual smell of cutting torch work. The face of a human freight vessel that had been built to carry steel, and was now asking her to trust it with her life. "Keep moving," Harwick said over the external speakers. "Go to the back of the bay, make room for the people behind you." She moved. Others followed. 1s and 2s at first, each Koreth pausing at the netting threshold, looking down through the mesh at the void below, then crossing with quick, precise steps that clicked against the ramp's metal surface. The sound of Koreth feet on human deck plating was distinctive, a sharp, chitinous tapping, like ceramic on steel, and as the numbers grew the tapping merged into a continuous percussive rhythm that echoed through the empty bay. Then groups of 5 and 6. Then a continuous stream. Koreth adults carrying children pressed flat against their chest carapaces, the children's smaller compound eyes wide and unfocused. Koreth archivists in smoke-stained formal robes with data crystals clutched in every available hand. Maintenance workers in singed coveralls, tool harnesses still strapped to their lower arms. Administrators whose hems were blackened and whose respiratory spiracles wheezed with each intake. They moved with a rigid, deliberate efficiency that Harwick recognized controlled terror, channeled into procedure, because procedure was what the Koreth had instead of panic. Raz stood at the ramp head like a bollard, his massive frame directing traffic with gestures that needed no translation. Left side, fill the gaps, children to the center. Maeve held position in the netting tunnel, magnetic boots locked to the mesh, catching anyone who stumbled or froze mid-crossing and pulling them forward. "You're through. Keep going. You're through." Over and over the same 3 phrases, steady as a metronome. Cole set up triage at the back of the bay. The cormorant's single medical stretcher, every blanket on the ship, The contents of the first aid kit spread across a cargo pallet. The Korath from the lower levels were dehydrated. Many had smoke damage to their spiracles. Several had minor carapace burns where they'd passed too close to superheated structural elements. Cole treated them with human medical supplies designed for human biology and should not have worked on Korath tissue. The burn gel sealed their wounds anyway. The rehydration fluid restored their spiracle function anyway. Cole didn't question it. He just kept working. By minute 15, the cargo bay was standing room only. Harwick watched on the internal cameras from the bridge a sea of burnished carapaces in copper and bronze and deep amber, compound eyes catching the fluorescent light, four-armed bodies packed shoulder to shoulder in a space that had been built to hold inanimate steel. The air in the bay had already changed. Warmer, denser, carrying the first traces of the copper-organic scent that Korath produced under stress, a pheromone compound that would, in the hours to come, saturate every ventilation duct and atmospheric filter aboard the Cormorant. At minute 22, the fire reached level 50. The airlock frame glowed along its lower edge. Maeve out of the tunnel, now. 6 more on the mesh, 20 seconds. The frame is in the thermal zone. 20 seconds den. 6 Korath scrambled through 2 carrying children. Maeve grabbed the last one, a juvenile with a soft-jointed carapace, hauled it onto the ramp, threw herself after it. The frame buckled 3 seconds later. Netting tore free. Blast doors sealed. Harwick pulled clear. 843 aboard. First pass complete. Harwick stood at the bridge viewport and looked at the spire through the glass. The fire was at level 52 now. 7 floors gained while they loaded. Through the optical feed, magnified, he could see the viewports on levels 70 and 80 and 90. Faces behind everyone. Compound eyes catching the reflected light of the fire below, watching the Cormorant pull away, watching their only exit move back into the dark. He wondered if they thought he was leaving. If they believed, watching the freighter's engine flare as he pulled clear of the spire's thermal zone, that the human ship had taken what it could carry and was done. If they were standing at those viewports doing the same arithmetic, he was doing fire climbing at 3 minutes per floor, Navy 11 hours out, and the ship that came is already full and moving away. He wondered, and then he stopped wondering, because wondering was a luxury he didn't have time for. VE atmospheric status. Strained, CO2 climbing, livable for 4 hours if we shut down crew quarters. Do it. Raz, Maeve, I need the secondary holds open. Maintenance crawlways, aft equipment bays, anything with a door and a seal. Run emergency atmospheric hose from the main system to every space you open. How many more are we looking at? Raz asked from the cargo bay, where 843 Korath were already filling the deck space that had held girders 20 minutes ago. Over 3,000 still in the spire. I'm going to try to take all of them. Raz paused, not from reluctance, from the kind of surprise that comes when someone tells you the number you expected is actually 3 times larger. Copy, he said. We'll make room. They worked fast. While Harwick brought the Cormorant around for a second approach, Raz and Maeve opened every auxiliary compartment on the ship. The secondary cargo holds 2 of them, each about a third the size of the main bay, got emergency hose connections run from the primary environmental manifold, chemical glow strips hung from ceiling brackets at 1-meter intervals, and their loading doors wedged open for air circulation with the main bay. The maintenance crawlways, which ran the length of the ship's ventral hull like arteries, were narrow enough that Korath adults would have to move single file with their secondary arms pressed flat. They got ventilation duct extensions improvised from flexible cargo tubing, taped into the access hatches with hull sealant. Even the reactor access corridor, hot, loud, and vibrating constantly from the reactor's cycling, got an air supply line. The aft equipment bay held spare parts, replacement ducting, rolls of hull sealant, emergency rations, and the crew's personal storage lockers. Raz and 2 cargo handlers cleared it in 4 minutes, stacking everything into the portside corridor and rigged a glow strip array across the ceiling. It could hold perhaps 60 Korath standing. Not comfortably, not safely by any standard that had ever been written in a manual, but it could hold them. They were creating living space out of mechanical spaces, turning a freighter's infrastructure into improvised shelter, making room for lives in a ship designed for steel. Every compartment they opened was another 30 or 40 or 60 bodies that the cormorant could carry, and every body was a name and a life, and a reason to go back to the burning building one more time. Jens and Surrey laid down cargo padding in the secondary holds, the thin industrial matting that went under magnetic racks to prevent deck scoring. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to keep Korath children from sitting on bare metal deck plating at ambient hull temperature, and it did that job adequately. Second approach, level 70 airlock. The gap was wider here 3 meters instead of 2, because the spire tapered as it rose, each level slightly narrower than the one below it, and the cormorant's broad, flat-sided hull sat poorly against the narrower upper sections. Maeve crossed the gap again with fresh netting and new anchor points, her EVA suit trailing a tether line that Raz paid out from the cargo bay's loading winch. She fired 3 magnetic anchors into the Korath airlock frame and pulled the netting taut using a ratchet system she improvised from cargo tie-down straps.